Hello, welcome, and thank you to all of you for tuning in and joining us for a very latest Oceanographic Roundtable discussion. This is, of course, the latest in our ongoing series of Oceanographic Roundtable events, and it's lovely to have such a robust number of you joining us this afternoon for it. This afternoon marks a very special one for us because this is our grand old 10th Roundtable discussion. Thank you to those of you who have stuck with us for all 9 previous editions so far. And I know that there have been some regular names each and every week, actually. So a big shout out before we go any further to Susan and to Charlie for keeping audience questions interesting. And of course, welcome to those of you that are joining us now for the first time. Where have you been all this time is the big question. All of our previous roundtable discussions, you'll be happy to hear, are available to watch back on demand via the Oceanographic website or to enjoy in podcast format across both Spotify and Apple Podcasts. These roundtable discussions are a chance each week for oceanographic audiences around the globe to join us as we dissect and dive into some of the biggest headlines across the ocean news and ocean storytelling space. Now, already in this series of live discussions, we have tackled the topics of the UK sewage crisis, the effectiveness of marine protected areas, the pervasiveness of microplastics, and latterly, the critical issue of fin whaling in Iceland and the severe overfishing crisis here in UK waters. Last week, I did manage to get my own way and get a positive news story across the line for a change as we dissected Sussex's nearshore trawling bylaw. But this week, it's back to the grindstone as we tackle one of the biggest and most impactful stories taking place across the ocean and science communities right now. And they don't get much bigger than this one, because this afternoon we are taking on the topic of the Atlantic Meridional Overturning Circulation, or the AMOC, which is how I'll be referring to it from now on. The AMOC and the very real fears that we are fast approaching a collapse and a point of no return for this critical planetary system. It is indeed a big issue, so here's a bit of background on the story so far. The AMOC has long been regarded as one of the Earth's most important climate regulating systems. Often described as a vast ocean conveyor belt, it transforms warm surface water northwards through the Atlantic before that water cools, becomes denser through increasing salinity, sinks into the deep ocean, and eventually circulates southwards again. This process helps distribute heat around the planet, moderating temperatures across Europe and North America, shaping tropical rainfall systems, and supporting marine ecosystems worldwide. Yet scientists are now warning that this circulation system may be weakening faster and more dangerously than previously understood, because new scientific research published this year has intensified concerns that the AMOC could be approaching a critical tipping point. By combining climate models with multiple real-world ocean observations, including sea surface temperatures and salinity measurements from different regions, researchers have found evidence that the AMOC may weaken around 60% more than standard climate projections currently estimate. Crucially, one study has found that the greatest uncertainty no longer comes primarily from future emission projections, but from differences between the climate models themselves. Now, this raises questions about whether existing models may have actually underestimated the scale of the risk. Professor Stefan Ramsdorf of the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research, who will be joining us this afternoon, has described the findings as very concerning, warning that the more pessimistic climate models now appear to align more closely with observational data. He has said he is increasingly worried that the AMOC could pass a shutdown tipping point in the middle of this century, making collapse effectively irreversible. Some believe the risks surrounding AMOC collapse have been greatly underestimated, and warn impacts are likely to include abrupt shifts in weather systems, major sea level rise along parts of the American Atlantic coast, disruption to tropical rainfall patterns, upheaval in marine ecosystems and fisheries, and reduced ocean absorption of carbon dioxide, accelerating global warming further still. And breathe. Because what makes the AMOC discussion especially urgent is that it sits at the intersection of science, uncertainty, and risk management. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change previously assessed that there was medium confidence that an abrupt collapse would not occur before 2100. But scientists now argue that subsequent research suggests the timeline may be narrowing considerably. The challenge facing policymakers, researchers, and communicators is therefore no longer simply understanding whether the AMOC is weakening, but how societies, should respond to the possibility that one of the planet's most important climate systems could be approaching a point of no return within the lifetimes of people around today. Now, this is a subject far too big for me to tackle on my own, so thankfully we have some experts in the house, and I think it's about time that we met them. So this afternoon we are indeed, and of course, joined by Professor Stefan Rahmstorf. Professor Stefan Rahmstorf is a renowned oceanographer and climatologist at the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research. His work primarily focuses on the dynamics of the Atlantic Meridional Overturning circulation, that's the AMOC, and its potential impacts on global climate patterns, making him a leading voice in discussions surrounding its stability and future. Stefan, I believe you are there. If you want to hit the go on stage button, you'll pop up and we can say hello. There you are. Hi, Stefan. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon.
Good to be here.
Thank you. Of course, joining us is Dr. Liefke Cesar, a climate scientist also based at the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research. Her research expertise includes analysing observed AMOC changes and their implications for regional climate, particularly in Europe, providing critical insights into the real-world consequences of a weakening or collapsing AMOC. Liefke, I believe you're there. Have you popped up on our screen?
I did. I hope so.
Great. There you are. Of course. Yes. Good to see you. And thanks so much for taking the time to join us. And then completing our formidable trio of experts is Laurie Laybourne. Laurie Laybourne is a climate strategist and an associate fellow at Chatham House, where he focuses on the systemic risks and national security implications of climate change. His work brings a crucial policy and strategic perspective to the discussion of the AMOC's potential collapse, considering its broader societal and geopolitical ramifications. And hello, Laurie. Thank you so much for joining us as well this afternoon.
My pleasure.
Great. Well, look, thank you so much. Thank you for everyone that's tuned in. I'm deeply honored to be joined by this panel of esteemed experts. I am also deeply out of my depth when it comes to the combined brain power between the three of you on my screen right now. I am, by the way, Rob Hutchins, community editor here at Oceanographic, and my role is to be asking all of the questions. But as with all of these roundtable discussions, this is the chance for you tuning in at home or wherever you are to ask your questions and be a part of the conversation too. So please don't be shy and post those questions into the chat, and I will endeavour to get those asked for you over the course of the next 30 minutes of discussion. Right. So that is definitely enough for me for the time being. Let's hear from our experts, and let's start with a word from each of you then. If we go around in order of how you appear on my screen, if we start with you, Laurie, in one sentence, what most concerns you about the current state of the AMOC debate in general?
That it's not at the heart of government decision-making. The risks that we're seeing very articulately communicated by the scientific community reach a threshold of seriousness that they need to be in the minds and in the discussions of those in governments who are at the very heart of understanding the biggest threats that our societies face and doing something about it. So one of my concerns is that is not having enough cut through into governments, though that is starting to change, as I'm sure we'll get into.
We definitely will get into that, because that's a very integral part of this conversation. But to lead on from that then, so Liefke, would you tell us in one sentence then what's concerning you most about the AMOC debate as it is right now?
I would say the focus of the debate, which is often on what are the uncertainties, what do we still not know, and really trying to dig into that, whilst we should be acknowledging that there will always be some uncertainties remaining. And from what we understand of the system so far, there's a very high risk attached to it. So we should be starting doing something. But instead of doing that, we are still on this point, okay, what else do we not know? Should be focusing on what we already know.
Yeah, and thank you for that, Liefke. And then obviously turning to you, Stefan, for your thoughts then, that one sentence of what's concerning you the most around how this debate is going right now, the state of this AMOC debate.
Yeah, it's actually quite similar to what Liefke said. I think that people wrongly think that if we're not certain that this is going to happen, then maybe we should do some more research and wait until we know for sure. But that's, of course, it's like you built a nuclear power plant and you thought it has a 1 in 1,000 chance to blow up, and then you find out, oops, the chances are far greater. are you really going to wait until you have a 99% surety that the thing will explode, or are you following some kind of precautionary principle?
Great. Yeah, well, thank you, all three of you, for setting the tone so wonderfully there, giving us a sense of urgency as well there, Stefan, kicking it off with the big headline there. And actually, to kick off then and to dive right into the conversation, if we stick with you, Stefan, so you've spent decades studying the AMOC. What has changed in the scientific evidence over the last few years that makes you more concerned now than before?
Well, I started on this AMOC stability question in 1991, right after my PhD. So that's 35 years ago by now. And for about 30 years of that, we considered this the risk of a major AMOC change or shutdown a low probability, high impact event. I used to say maybe 5% probability, but I thought that is too high for this kind of consequences that this would have. But your question, why have I changed my probability estimate a lot? Now I think it's more likely than not that we pass the tipping point for AMOC collapse. The first one, I might show you perhaps a slide on that, if that's okay with you.
Absolutely, please do.
Just takes a second.
You just wait for that to
window. Okay. I hope it's visible now.
It's just loading.
When it's there.
There we go.
So yeah, about 2 years ago, I was shown these kind of curves. These are model projections of the strength of the AMOC going into the future. And up to the year 2100, they were part of the typical IPCC report. These are the standard models that we call CMIP6. That's the Climate Model Intercomparison Project number 6 for the 6th IPCC report. Many models have participated there. And those runs until the IPCC report deadline had gone until 2100 and are part of the kind of wide range of how much the AMOC weakens by 2100. But then quite a few of those runs have been continued beyond the year 2100. And I first saw these results of the continued runs at a workshop 2 years ago in Holland. And I was a bit shocked because a substantial number of those runs lead to a collapsed AMOC. And that's the subset that is the ones that are shown here. Particularly concerning is that these are 3 different emission scenarios, and high emissions are red. And out of 9 models for high emission scenarios that had been continued beyond 2100, all 9 have led to a shutdown AMOC. And so that was quite shocking to me. Also, the fact that even some of the low emission scenarios, the blue ones, even though not many were actually continued there beyond 2100, a couple of them led to a collapsed AMOC. And we concluded in this study that we then subsequently published last year that all the models that in 2100 are below about 10 Sverdrup strength, all those are actually then doomed to collapse. None of those basically recover when they're that weak. And so that's why on the slide here on the right-hand side, you see less than 10 Sverdrup. That's 10 million cubic meters per second water transport in the year 2100 is a very likely sign that they're already on the way to collapse. And so this was the first piece of evidence that really shocked me, because we had considered the chance of this happening until then as much smaller.
Wow. Yeah. Thank you for sharing that, Stefan. And actually, we have a question already from Mary, and I think it's the question that everybody's probably dying to ask. So, and I have got this for later on in the conversation, but I think it would be remiss not to get this out there right now. But how quickly would reducing our emissions change the fate of the AMOC in this case, and how quickly reversible is a tipping point?
I think at this point I might mention a second study that you would have asked me about anyway, and I will share my slides again. Actually, might have well have left them up, but well, only take a second. Okay, we're here, and now this was kind of a subset of all the models. I might go back one. This is all the models as they were shown in the IPCC report. They were actually laid on top of each other, even though because it's an anomaly here on the left-hand scale. But you see the huge uncertainty range from almost no AMOC weakening, the upper edge here of the uncertainty range, to less than 10 Sverdrup. On average, they're weakening by about 5 Sverdrup. From if the present day is 17, they go down to -5 of that, that would be 12. But now there has been a study by French colleagues from Bordeaux who put some, they compared these models to observations because they wanted to find out if we have such a big uncertainty range, what does that actually depend on? And can we decide by comparing with observational data, which of this huge bunch of models is actually the most realistic ones? And so to cut the long story short, what they did on the left-hand bar here on the bar chart, you have the range of uncertainty of these models by the year 2100, roughly. And you see on average, they're at about 12 Sverdrup, but there's a huge uncertainty range. Now, if you apply this observation constraint, you shrink that uncertainty a lot. That's this black bar here. And unfortunately, the average of that also reduces to 8 Sverdrup. That's that 60% reduction that you mentioned in your introduction.
Right.
And so now you see that is below that critical 10 Sverdrup that we considered as when they are beyond the point of no return and they're gonna basically shut down. And even that whole uncertainty range, all those models are still below that 10 Sverdrup threshold. So you conclude that actually the vast majority of the models that are considered realistic according to that observational constraint are on the way to collapse in the year 2100. And now I come to the questioner's question, what do the emissions have to do with that? And you can see at the bottom here, the 4 different emission scenarios that were considered after applying the observational constraint and how strong the AMOC is at the end of this century. And for the 3 on the right here that I marked in red, it's all around about 8 Sverdrup. So intermediate emission scenarios, high emissions, very likely they're going to be on the way to shut down in 2100. And you can see by the fact that they don't differ much in strength there, that the different emissions here don't play any role anymore, which is a strong indication that the models are now weakening under self-amplifying feedback and not driven by any further emissions. So they've become immune to emissions here. They are just kind of shutting down. The only difference is that low emission scenario that sticks to the Paris Climate Agreement goals. There we end up on average at 13 Sverdrup, which is still above that shutdown threshold. And so my conclusion from this study, which I think is a reliable study, a good quality study, is that only the low emissions Paris Agreement, really sticking to the Paris Agreement path, gives us a good chance to avoid this AMOC shutdown.
Okay. Well, thank you for sharing that, Stefan. That's both startling and also a little glimmer of hope. And actually, just want to call out a shout out to Russell Arnott, who's just posted here, if it helps, and it does help, Russell, actually, so really appreciate this. 1 Sverdrup is approximately equal to the summed output of water from every river on Earth every second. Is that accurate? That's accurate, which is a hell of a lot of water. Startling. That's really startling. Thank you for that, Stefan. Actually, to turn to you then, Lievke, and to talk about what this looks like, the impacts of this. What does this look like in real terms then, in this system terms, in real world signals that the system is already weakening and then getting worsening?
You mean in sense of what we're already seeing, the evidence for a weakening already being underway?
Yes, please. Let's start there.
Yeah, so that's actually going back to what I did or started my PhD with Stefan. Is we call it the famous cold block, basically, that roughly when you look at a global map, you can see that over the course of the last century, due to our emissions of greenhouse gases, we see warming everywhere. Of course, there are some different patterns. We know, for example, that land tends to warm faster than the oceans, and the polar regions also have some kind of amplifications. But we see this clear pattern of warming everywhere. We do not see it in the subpolar North Atlantic around Greenland. And that kind of started a little bit off as a mystery case, right? Why? What's so different about this place? And this is now where it's actually kind of the obvious answer. We do know that the AMOC transports such huge amounts of heat into that region. So obviously a weakening of that current, of this transport of heat, would lead to a localized cooling. And when you crunch the numbers, you actually can see that everything that we see can be explained by a weakening of the overturning circulation from about mid last century until today by 10 to probably more 20%. We do see more evidence for that. It's also related to, probably the Gulf Stream. If you're having a lot of people in the ocean interested here, is part of the overturning circulation system. It's also a little bit different, but basically we've got this strong Gulf Stream current, which normally has a certain deflection point from the US coast where it starts going towards Europe. We see a change in that deflection point that can also be mathematically, simulation-wise, and so on, linked to a weaker overturning circulation. So we have a lot of evidence for that, and that's really just the beginning. There are also spares, but there are direct observational data on the overturning in the past, partly taken from actually ship cruises, research cruises. Since 2004, there is a very complicated network of measurement systems, and all these also actually support the signal of a weaker AMOC. The only difficulty, and that's why I started off also why we are focusing, in my opinion, too much on the uncertainties, is that it is still a natural system that has some variability. There are basically, and once we started measuring the AMOC on a very short tempo scale, a lot of scientists were surprised by the amount that such a huge system, where you normally assume a lot of lag, can vary. So that is quite big, which is why often we call this the signal to noise ratio. When you have a lot of noise, then it's sometimes a bit difficult to see a signal. But still, we do see in the direct observational data, in all these different evidences, it is a heat transport, but there are also data that are even going further back in time when it comes to how the organisms in the ocean react to an overturning circulation weakening. All this would be supporting that the overturning circulation is getting weaker.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you for that overview. And from there, and for anyone that's sort of new to the subject, what would the impact of this be then on? So in the intro, I mentioned the ecosystems, impact on marine ecosystems, weather patterns. What could we be expecting in that sense?
That's a huge bucket that you're opening here, and it's a complicated question in the sense of it depends where you are. The overturning circulation is a global system, so obviously we are seeing global impacts, and they depend on where you are, with a tendency of a cooling signal in the northern hemisphere, additional warming in the southern hemisphere. But as you said, we are also really talking about a shift in how the nutrients are distributed. There are studies showing a huge impact on marine ecosystems in the North Atlantic. We also know that because the overturning circulation is impacting the distribution of heat, it is changing other large circulation systems, like, for example, the intertropical convergence zone. So it's really important for all the different monsoon systems. Where do we expect rainfall, whether it's in Africa and Asia? We do, and you already mentioned that, we know there's a connection to sea level rise, especially for the US East Coast. But So it's very difficult to say what exactly will happen, because it really depends on where you are, how fast the weakening is going to happen, and then of course what additional pressures are we putting on the system. But I think important is to note that we are not just talking about a simple response in temperature, like saying, okay, there's a little bit of additional cooling here and warming there. We're also really talking about shifts in the dynamics, potentially more storms in the winter time, but also more heat extremes even in the summertime. And that just makes it very, very complex.
Totally. Yeah. Thank you for talking me through that. And obviously that's going to have Laurie, and you've been sat there very patiently waiting for your time to shine. But because obviously that's going to have some big impacts on the way that societies operate and the whole geopolitical system, which is in a precarious state as it is at the best of times. So perhaps we can turn to you and get your insight on the sort of what impacts we'd be expecting there, and give us a bit of a brief overview of the work that you're doing in that regard.
So the first thing to say is that there haven't been enough assessments of what would actually happen to societies. This is a part of a huge blind spot in how we do actually assess the threat that derives from climate change. Of those studies that we have seen, we see things like Livka just mentioned about the shift or the disruption to monsoons across the world. And that would be it would be ruinous for many, many countries and entire regions. If you disrupt the primary mechanism by which you are able to grow crops, it will have a potentially devastating impact on food supply, food prices, the global food system, on economic stability, social stability, political stability. Right now, we're kind of living through another version of what happens when we get global scale shocks with the war in the Middle East. We obviously had one with COVID. We had one with the consequences of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Imagine that, but on a far bigger scale and more severe, and all of the ripple effects then heading out across the world. This would be a cataclysm, not just climatically, but societally as well. And interestingly, it doesn't have to happen, or the effects have to play out before that kind of societal instability really gets going. So let's say we reach a critical threshold of realization that the kind of warnings that we're seeing presented there by Stefan are really actually playing out. The AMOC is really beyond a point in which it is going to tip, and we're going to see a fuller collapse. The effects might not even need to happen for there to be massive societal destabilization. So, for example, if you are in parts of the world that are dependent upon those monsoons, or you're in Europe where there could be far colder, stormier, even dry conditions as well, that's one of the potential effects. The knowledge that those kind of things are coming could have an impact in the present day. That future effect could be drawn into the present day by, for example, the behavior of financial markets that say, whoa, hang on a minute, over this time period, this place is not a good place to invest in. And that could mean that destabilization comes even before the physical effects occur. So overall here, we're looking at a situation where this would be a vast change to the climate system, as we're hearing, and as a consequence, have cataclysmic effects for societies that could start even before the actual physical things kick into gear. This really is the threat here is a reminder for those who need reminding, or realization for those that don't know, of the stakes that we now face when it comes to the scale of the destabilization of the Earth system, of the climate crisis that is playing out. What we just discussed there is just not at the forefront of some pretty important institutions' understanding of that climate threat. They still are seeing it as a longer term problem that evolves gradually and probably won't even be that bad if you live outside the tropics. And threats like potential AMOC collapse, they really disrupt that kind of false model of the threat that we face here.
Yeah, absolutely, and thank you. And I think this leads in perfectly to the question that Mary had. It was the next question on mine, but actually, I feel like you've started half answering that one already. But the government's general understanding of these of the tipping point risks there and what's at stake and the cataclysmic sort of effect that we're staring at. And I'm going to pinch from Mary's question: are policymakers willfully ignorant to this, or just completely ignorant to the threat?
So there's a lot that goes into this, right? So let me give you a few. So we're not helped by the uncertainty issue that both Stefan and Levko have talked about, right? Often when it comes to climate change related issues in governments and other important institutions, uncertainty is something that decision makers get stuck on or they misinterpret, right? So for example, with tipping points, they have often been described as high impact, low likelihood events, often acronymized to HILL, H-I-L-L, high impact, low likelihood HILL events, right? And that from day one was a problem because A, it isn't accurate to describe them as that. It never has been. They're high impact, high uncertainty events. And as we've heard, there's increasing evidence to say that actually, as the uncertainty is reduced, there's a higher likelihood than we thought. But when a decision maker hears low likelihood, they might think, no likelihood? That's pretty uncertain. We don't really care about that. And that goes against how we usually do risk assessment for other threats. We focus on the worst that could happen. We identify that it's plausible, and then we really start to worry about it, right? You don't, for example, obsess about the chances of that horrendous crash happening in Ahmedabad in India, the Air India crash that we had a while back. You don't obsess about the possibility of that. You say, look, is it possible? Is it plausible that this could happen, right? Full stop. And would it be catastrophic? And if the answer to those two questions is yes, you actually start to focus on what's going on there. With climate, we don't necessarily do that for a bunch of complex reasons, including a tension between the culture of hard science, which is much more about wanting to be absolutely sure about something before you go shouting about it, and the culture of risk assessment, which is that you want to know about everything that could plausibly happen and focus on those things. But then there are other challenges that come with this. They include that we don't yet have those risk assessments, those impact assessments that are what we could describe as decision useful. It isn't that useful to hear something like the tropical rain belt would shift if you're a decision maker, because you need someone to then run with that and say, well, hang on a minute, if the monsoons were disrupted, that's an impact on crops, that's an impact on food system stability, that's an impact on trade and geopolitics, and on like this. Because it's those things that you care about, right? It's those things that you wake up in the morning, you're worried about. You're not worried about the intertropical convergence zone, you're worried about food system stability and things like this. And we don't yet have the assessments that join all those dots together to be used by decision makers. And then the last one I'll just chuck in there, there's many more that we could discuss, is this difficulty about what we do in response to this. So, you know, if AMOC were to collapse or you know, a greater reduction in strength were to play out, that could present response challenges that are very different to what decision makers are currently making decisions around at the moment. For example, the one that's often used is that Europe will become much cooler. And at the moment, governments, if they're even bothering to develop robust climate adaptation, are not doing it for colder conditions. And the answer to that is we need to explore what we could call no regret strategies, where if AMOC were to collapse or not, these are the things that you should be doing in any of those scenarios. A good example of this, a slightly simple and you know, prosaic example is installation of building stock. We should be doing that anyway because it helps reduce emissions and deals with climate change at source. We should be doing it anyway because it will improve quality of life for people. We should be doing it anyway because it increases energy security, and regulating temperature better will help us if AMOC collapses or not. So it's a win-win-win-win-win across the board. And there are many other things that need to happen. But at the moment, we're in a situation where those kind of no regret options for all of these scenarios are on the table for decision makers, linked to threat assessments that are telling them now that we've reached this new, much graver stage of the climate crisis.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Laurie, for taking us through that so comprehensively as well. And that's made very clear in my mind. You explained that very eloquently, and I appreciate that. It's helped with my education. And I know that we've sort of touched on this, Stefan, but to loop it back to you, and one of the questions I had was about the credible pathway to slowing or stabilizing the AMOC if governments acted aggressively now. But rather than going over that old ground, I wonder what your perspective is on a stasis in inaction or paralysis in action? I want just to get your thoughts on the situation as we see it from a governmental, like a global government point of view.
You mean just in the last couple of years?
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I think we are seeing quite a major backlash against climate policies, which has a lot to do, of course, with governments like in the United States, the Trump administration, which are actively hostile to climate policy and climate science. And behind that, there is, in my view, a massive lobby power of the fossil fuel industry, one of the richest industries in the world, which I think has understood that their days are numbered. We are going to get out of fossil fuels, and they are fighting to prolong the time where they can make major profits as much as they can. And they have strongly supported Trump being elected, and they also have a lot of power in other countries. And that is at least part of the reason for this backlash that we are seeing now.
Yeah, thank you. Sorry, I was gulping water there at the time. And there was a question that we had earlier, and it actually leads into one of the questions I had as a follow-up one for you, Stefan, about some of the technological fixes that may be out there, and are there any dangerous misconceptions around those? And I don't want to sort of diminish the question that we had from Aaron around what are the speaker's thoughts about using something like solar radiation management to try and prevent the collapse of the AMOC. Is there any sort of viable or credible response there?
Personally, I don't believe in this kind of techno fix because of major risk of side events, then the side effects, which are very difficult to control. There is no easy fix to keep the AMOC going. And also, there is no regulatory structure. It's maybe something Laurie can comment on more. Imagine individual nations just starting to do that. That's actually part of a novel ministry for the future, where one country starts doing solar radiation manipulation, and that might lead to negative side effects on other nations. So that could lead to major conflicts. And another issue is that if you do that, you can't just turn up and down the sun. You have to put a lot of aerosols into the atmosphere. They basically don't stay there for very long. They kind of trickle down again. And but the CO2 does stay to a large part, even for many thousands and in tens of thousands of years. So once you start to create this dangerous balance between having high CO2 levels, but then aerosols that you have to keep up there to counter the effect of the CO2. Now just imagine in some time in the future, in 3,600 years or whatever, there is some crisis on Earth and you can't keep up the constant renewal of these aerosols, then you're going to get hit within months by all the warming that is coming from that high CO2 level. So you basically doom generations after us to keep doing this solar radiation manipulation in order to prevent total loss of control.
Yeah, no, thank you for fielding that one. And I want just briefly then, Laurie, if you had a few thoughts on that same question about the fixes.
I mean, we should never describe them as fixes, right? These are like almost desperate tools that we might consider in a wider toolkit in a desperate situation. That we're even having this conversation shows you the seriousness of where we find ourselves globally. You know, we are in a situation where it is now plausible that a part of the climate system effectively breaks down, and therefore there are huge question marks over the stability of all the monsoons, of the ability for Europe to maintain its infrastructure and also its farming. You know, the list goes on of potential AMOC impacts, some of which I put in the chat here. And that kind of extreme possibility requires an equally a toolkit that matches the gravity. Now, some of that, of course, is an utter doubling down on the reduction of emissions. There is no way out of any of this without sorting out the problem of emissions going into the atmosphere. But we cannot invoke the potential impacts that an AMOC collapse would bring that are so severe without wanting to understand at least what the contingency set of potential tools are. But then we get stuck in a really vexatious situation, which is that those tools come with potential side effects and are highly uncertain and are very hard to really understand what they would do, as Stefan is going through, right? What I would say on this is that for me, the nightmare is that we have basically ungoverned, we lead, this is all largely ungoverned, these ideas of technologies that would, for example, spray particulates into the stratosphere to try and cool the planet down. This is largely ungoverned. And that's a massive problem because we are on a trajectory now, I think, where more and more people will understand threats like AMOC, and it will inspire more and more people to want to do something potentially quite radical and unilaterally, whether that be a government or, I would say, even more worrying, a private company. And there are now a number of private companies who are increasingly playing around in this space with no accountability, effectively.
Yeah.
So all I can do really is present a nightmare scenario, which is that a private company in an ungoverned future unilaterally deploys some kind of technology that they probably don't even understand in a desperate attempt to handle a desperate situation. And so the risk that we have right now is a lack of governance and people taking seriously what needs to be done to understand that particular tool. But the last thing I'll say is there has to be a toolkit here. There is no scenario in which interventions into the climate system, so-called geoengineering that we're talking about here, is the only thing. It's as a tactical intervention in a very difficult strategic situation. And so it's got to be alongside a whole bunch of other stuff that handles just the sheer complexity of this risk that we're now faced with.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks, Laurie, and thanks, Stefan. And so I'm very aware of, firstly, time, and secondly, of you, Liefke, and I really want to come back to your insight and expertise on all of this this conversation as well. And I wonder, actually, firstly, I saw you nodding and I saw you sort of shaking your head a couple of those points as Stefan and Laurie were talking us through. I wonder if you wanted to share any thoughts on those initially on that topic there.
Yeah, I guess based on what I've encountered and the people I talk to and so on, I often feel like when it comes to these technological fixes, it's not necessarily about whether it's doable or not that will convince people not to do it, because that's the one inside that all the tests that are done, all the modeling studies that we do show that it's not doable in terms of scale, of the energy that would actually be needed, of the resources needed to use these fixes. But, and I think that's actually a big problem that, and also regarding to this question on why is nobody or policymakers are not doing anything about it. Policy decisions are not necessarily based on facts, right? They're often actually based on frameworks, on values. And I do know that there's a big community out there that is hoping for these technological fixes, because some years ago, there are some great technological fixes when it comes, for example, to medicine, or maybe technological advancement for communication. And I think because of that, there's such a strong belief, hope that this should also be possible when it comes to the Earth system. But that's on a very, very different scale. And I think often people do forget that when we talk about the AMOC, for example, the amount of heat, water that is being transported, that cannot be reproduced by human hand, that those are energy amounts that are not comparable to anything that we are doing. And I guess that's sometimes a point also where I get a little bit frustrated that sometimes people are looking for science for the answers on what to do, but they don't actually really want to listen to the facts, because it's more about what do we value, what is actually more valuable for us, what's happening in the next 5 years, or what our great-great-grandchildren will encounter in the future. And we're looking here at problems that are actually going to impact life on such a long scale. And that is sometimes can be quite exhausting, because we're mixing very different things. We frame it as a scientific discussion, but it's actually not a discussion just. It's really also a lot about emotions, what we hope should be doable, fear of what might happen, and we don't want to realize that. And that just tends to make it very exhausting from time to time.
And actually, you've spoken there quite poetically into a question that I quite like from Martin. And if we're looking at the possibility of reaching a tipping point in 25 years, then is it realistic to expect that global warming can be reduced enough in that time to prevent the collapse of the AMOC in this instance? Or should the message be that this is going to happen and we should prepare for those scenarios?
Well, basically, that is what I have shown about these results of the model projections, that if we get back onto, or what back is wrong, if we get onto a Paris climate agreement compatible scenario, that means getting out of fossil fuel as fast as we can, we do still have a chance to greatly reduce the risk of passing that tipping point. And so absolutely, we should not go into a kind of a doomer position saying, well, it's too late now. So also because the idea that what is the alternative then? Then people say, okay, it's too hard to prevent this, so let's adapt. But this is an event, a catastrophe of a magnitude that I don't think we can adapt in an orderly fashion. And I'm also a paleoclimatologist. I got drawn into paleoclimate in the early 90s as soon as I started working on AMOC, because we have seen massive AMOC changes in the last 100,000 years of Earth's history. And they are the most drastic and impactful events that we see there in the last 100,000 years across the tropics, also across the northern continents. So even if we can't exactly predict what does this mean for agriculture and all these things, they have hardly been investigated. And it would also be very difficult, because how do we know we can trust models on regional impacts on agriculture? That it gets more and more uncertain. The more regional you get, the more you are talking about extreme events rather than mean climate and all these things. But even if we can't predict exactly what it will be, I think all the paleoclimatologists who know about these past AMOC shift events will say these are events we must try to avoid at all cost.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Stefan, for jumping on that one and answering that one for us. And just totally conscious of time, and I know that we've got some hard stops in a few minutes. So I just thought we'd turn once again to you, Lievke, and just to ask then about this very, very interesting question, and very critical question about the communication around this, and how can we be better communicating this. How do we get that tone right? How do we strike the proper educational tone? What is the state that current health of the education here, and how do we better communicate this?
Very good and difficult question. Highlighting that, of course, I'm not a communication expert, but I would say there's a difficulty in how I would, for example, communicate or discuss the topic with my scientific colleagues, where I would always focus on the uncertainty and say, okay, this is what we know, but this tiny detail maybe not. And this then being often one-on-one translated to how this is communicated with the public, kind of saying, okay, this is really new and this is what is done. And that's dangerous, because my colleagues, they know the backstory. They can actually have a framing, and they can sort a new study into the larger picture and say, okay, this is working with this, contradicting this. Most of the public don't. And they suddenly get like this one headline and they don't know the context. And that's very difficult. So when it comes to climate science in general, this, I guess, journalism jargon of trying to make a headline, or this is new, No, scientific knowledge is basically growing very staggering steps to step. It's not even always linear. And we are trying to make it always the big bangs in communication. That's difficult. Of course, I do get that this might draw more attention. So I'm not going to say that I know the best way of doing it, but definitely one good way is to at least always give the interested reader the possibility to for a deep dive, to actually say, okay, these are the other studies out there. Also give a sense of, okay, where is the basically the consensus, where do the majority of the studies tend to go? That would be quite important. And then when it comes actually to action, it would be also putting it in the framing of the overall climate crisis, of course. And there, it's again one of the major points. I think we often focus a lot on AMOC, and it's cool, it's really interesting. But of course, when it comes to AMOC protection, that is quite simple reduction of greenhouse gases, which also benefits so many other points. And to do that, or to know that we have to do that, we do not need another AMOC study, because this is already known and has been known for decades.
A very salient point, and well, thank you very much. So conscious of time, I knew that we'd be in this situation where this is such an engaging conversation. We've had such a number of questions and comments from you guys watching as well. Just really want to sort of close out then. Maybe we can get a closing thought from each of you as to one key takeaway that we have from this discussion, or you know, an action or a something to leave this discussion with. Whether that's an actionable step or a thought. Laurie?
I think I would urge people to have a look at the state of how governments are now talking about this. So the Icelandic government has stuck its head up and declared AMOC risk as a national security concern. That's very significant. It means that it is now taking it at that level of seriousness of threats like pandemics and war, which I think is the appropriate thing to do. And I would urge people to ask the awkward questions to those they know around them, and in relation to their decision makers, around why it is that the climate challenge has been left so mismanaged that we now cannot rule out something happening that would be, as Stefan has described, basically globally cataclysmic. And this is things like AMOC collapse really are the moment of reality check when it comes to what's happened with the climate crisis. So really thinking about how this underlines the severity of the situation we're in, and asking themselves the question, what kind of forces in our society could finally get us to take this collectively as seriously as possible? Because the current array of forces clearly are not in the right direction, and something there needs to change.
Great. A strong thought to leave us with. Thank you, Laurie. Stefan, same question to you. One concrete action or thought to take away from this one.
Well, for me, it's important that the only way how we can reduce this risk is to actually stick to the Paris Climate Agreement, a legally binding agreement that all the governments agreed to after decades of debate since the first climate summit in Rio in 1992. And it is incredible. I could not have imagined that as a young scientist, that even a democratic government like Germany, you have to take to court to actually implement a climate policy that is compatible with this agreement that every single member of the German parliament ratified.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you so much, Stefan. And then obviously to you, Liefke, just to take us out with your thought.
Yeah, maybe kind of a more personal message. So I'm really grateful that there are so many people interested in the science, but also have to say that, and I just saw that somebody in the comments kind of compared this to the movie Don't Look Up. And that resonated with me because there, of course, a younger scientist, female scientist, is basically being called as being too catastrophic, crying, and so on. And that's actually a valid concern why I, for example, often tone down my emotional response when I discuss the science, because emotions tend to make us more subjective and science is to be objective. But in this sense, we are talking about a crisis here. And as Stefan mentioned, there is a huge lobbying force trying to drive us into the wrong direction. But I also know that the majority of people actually are behind doing something for climate protection. And just for everybody to remember that and then act out on that. And if a solution sounds too easy, please try to get behind it, check it yourself, and don't be fooled, basically, because this is something that is impacting all of us, but it's also something where we can do something, but it also has to be a systemic change. So it's not on everybody's individual shoulders in terms of change your style of life. It's also really something that has to be changed at the governmental level.
Perfect. Thank you. Great conclusion. Thank you so much. I don't want to take any more of your time up, so I'll say goodbye to you all. Thank you so much for your time and energy and insights. I really appreciate you giving over that time this afternoon. And thanks everybody who's tuned in throughout, deeply engaged. You've been asking some wonderful questions. Sorry to anyone that we've not been able to get to with their questions. But if you've enjoyed this, please do come back next week for the next Oceanographic Roundtable. We'll be dissecting next week's biggest news story at the same time in the same place. And do check out Oceanographic platform for the latest details on our live Ocean Talks events, as well as our printed magazine and everything else that we have to offer. And that leaves me with nothing more to add or say other than have wonderful evenings. And thank you again, all of you. Cheers.
Cheers. Thank you for listening.